With STALKER 2 Heart of Chernobyl, it is easy to see where the years of work have paid off. Incredible atmosphere and environments, rounded off with systemic gameplay that really lives up to the spirit of the original. This is looking to be a great sequel to that cult classic from 2007. Just as I can see the good things though, I can also notice the technical issues that STALKER 2 has at release. Some are small and silly, but others are larger and more serious. So that is what this video will be about today. The areas where STALKER 2 excels, especially on PC, and those areas where it has issues, including a cross-platform look to see how the game fares on both Xbox Series S and X. So suit up, STALKER, and let's explore how STALKER 2 fares on Xbox and PC at release. STALKER 2's greatest technical strengths are in its atmosphere, environmental artwork, and dedication to authentic-looking assets and props. The look and feel of the zone is seared into the brains of many millennials who played it on PC, such as myself, and achieving that again more than 15 years later is surely at the top of GSC Game World's list of priorities. To accomplish it as well as they have, the game heavily utilizes a number of the headline-grabbing UE5 features and some good old-fashioned technical artistry. One of the first things to praise are the natural aspects of the exclusion zone, and specifically its vegetation. Climb up a tower and it is easy to see that the game's vegetation is dense in any given frame and extends far into the distance, with you not really being able to see where the grass ends in any given view. Terrain never looks weirdly naked or oddly sparse, as it is always overgrown with wild things such as trees, bushes, and grass. Given the version of UE5 that this is shipping on, a branch of 5.1, the vegetation looks good but does have its limitations though. Vegetation doesn't appear to be nanite geometry, so it'll have standard levels of details that you can see changing while moving backwards and forwards. Another thing is that their shadowing sometimes is less than ideal, either lacking any treatment from the game's virtual shadow maps, or just being shadow casting in screen space. Still, it probably takes a lot of GPU cycles to enable such distinct, consistent density across the entire world, so the compromises to shading do make a bit of sense. In the end though, this game's views and vegetation impress, especially in the mid to far distance. Next to the vegetation, another strength comes from the game's hard surface modeling and texturing. The game on PC weighs in at 154 gigabytes on disk, and I think it's easy to see where all that storage space is being used. Textures across the entire game are universally high res, where any little bit of old rusty junk tends to hold up incredibly and surprisingly well to the closest levels of scrutiny. One of my favorite things is that the model detail also tends to hold up really well on account of the use of nanite here. So small brick inlays, mortar, broken concrete, and much more across the environment get real geometric detail to back up the high resolution textures. Scattered assets of all types are this way. Machinery and broken down vehicles see a similar level of treatment where things like tires and wheels will have an impressive amount of detail up close. Basically, most of the objects in the game world that you will happen upon will have scarcely a polygon edge in sight at normal view distance while walking around. And due to the high quality texturing and material work, mostly everything looks like it belongs in the rusty, weathered world that it inhabits. Weapon models included. Being a first-person shooter, you definitely spend a lot of time around guns in this game, and thankfully, unlike the original STALKER from 2007, they animate and look fantastic in motion and hold up well when you look up close. Broken and old guns will show high levels of wear and detail that become visible each and every time you have to clear a jam. The materials are particularly praiseworthy here, as weapons such as shotguns, for example, show great differentiation between the metals and the wood grains found on the stocks and forward grips. I'm not too far into the story and haven't seen everything yet, but every single new weapon I've come across has looked and sounded excellent when being shot. Beyond those smaller details, one of the things making the world come alive is the game's weather system. There is, of course, your standard rain, replete with darkened volumetric clouds, but the game also has more exotic, anomalous weather from its science fiction setting. Storms that stain the world below with a yellow hue are there, with particles flying around all close to the camera, and even super hazardous storms that will kill you almost immediately that show off really impressive moving VDBs that are lit with each and every lightning strike. The weather looking so good was not something I expected based upon the pre-release material, so I was pleasantly surprised with the variety of weather and environmental hazards that I confronted while playing this game. I was also similarly pleased with the game's cutscenes, which were barely there in the original. There aren't too many directed cutscenes in comparison to other games, but what you get is similar to what you might find in a modern Call of Duty title. All the cutscenes are depicted from the first-person camera view, with your character interacting with the environment or other characters using expressive hand motions. Generally, in these cutscenes, the NPCs animate well and have convincing-looking hair and skin, and their facial mimicry lines up with the dialogue. I was playing the game in Ukrainian with subtitles, which had lip syncing, but was also pleasantly surprised to see that even English voice acting lines up really well. Another thing that I liked about the English voice acting in this game is that the characters did not have stereotypical Eastern European accents, which can range from terrible to comical in the games that do that. It always seems silly to me when movies or games taking place in a certain area of the world give characters accents and localization, which the narrator or character inhabiting that world would never perceive. Either way, the game sounds surprisingly good in English if you want to play it that way, but for those of you looking for the authentic experience, I definitely recommend the Ukrainian audio here with subtitles. So the presentation is generally great in the game, but I do have some smaller criticisms of some of the game's visual elements. My first is with shadow casting lights, or better said, the lack thereof at times. A number of light sources in the game are non-shadow casting, but I wish they were. So at times you'll see people gathered around the fire, but the fire itself will not be casting shadows. This one is odd to me, as this is an area where the original game was far ahead of its peers in 2007. It included things like muzzle flash shadows and shadows from your flashlight, both of which are actually oddly missing in Stalker 2. Your flashlight does not seem to cast shadows, and I think that strips the game of some of its atmosphere it otherwise would have. Likewise, the enemy and your own muzzle flashes are non-shadow casting, which is once again a detriment to the game's atmosphere. Here I would love a high-end shadow option, which would enable shadows from such light sources. My biggest visual issue with the game, though, comes from Lumen. Now, Stalker 2 has typical Lumen issues, which are exacerbated by its use of software Lumen, which relies on a lot of screen space information to do its diffuse lighting and specular reflections. These are pretty typical UE5 issues, but it can look odd at moments, like we see here in the store, where moving toward the entrance shows all manner of light leaking from outside and shadowing disappearing in and out of existence depending upon where I am looking. I really would love a hardware ray tracing option for Lumen if possible in future patches to avoid such lighting issues as much as possible, and to get some nice bonuses like vegetation being added into reflections. The devs have hinted that such a thing might be added post-release, so let's cross our fingers and hope it comes to the game soon enough. All the footage you have seen up to this point in this video has been from the PC version on high-end kit. How do the Xbox versions look and compare? Here there are a few key differences beyond resolution and performance. For one, you have the differences in fidelity of vegetation at a distance, and up close at times, with PC taking the lead here. But honestly, even that Series S version has a shocking amount of vegetation on screen at all times. Another difference is in the quality of shadows. Both the Series S and the Xbox Series X version in performance mode have lower quality VSMs from opaque objects, so there will be a bit more imprecision and jitter in shadows there, while the quality mode looks a lot like the PC version in this regard. Likewise, Lumen is downgraded across the board on consoles, meaning the quality of of the SDFs being traced against is lower, leading to more deformed objects in reflections and a greater propensity for lighting errors in GI. Take for example here, where the Series X in performance mode combined with its low internal resolution and low quality lumen diffuse tracing leads to a flickering in the scene where you meet Richter. Series S and the quality mode and PC at its epic settings do not show such errors, even though they have slightly different resolves in that GI due to quality differences. This scene here also shows off one of the last core differences between the versions, and that is the quality of transparency and hair. As we can see with this window to the world outside, only the PC version on epic settings and Xbox Series X in quality mode managed to properly shade the window translucency there, while Series S and X in performance mode have it practically non-existent. If you look at any translucent objects like windows in the game, you can see that the X version in performance mode and Series S simplify the shading there, making it look less enmeshed into the environmental lighting at times. Same with hair rendering, which we can see in the game's intro here, where it is much simplified in performance mode and on Series S. Which makes sense though given the 60 FPS performance target on X in its performance mode and the general weakness of the Series S GPU. As for resolutions, I think the game can look a little bit iffy at times on console. I believe dynamic resolution is in play, though the TSR artifacts I see in this game while it is moving make pixel counting an honest nightmare, but what I've counted shows Series S being as low res as we are used to for UE5 games, running between 648p in the heavier moments all the way up to 864p when looking toward the sky, and reconstructed up to 1080p with TSR. On Series X performance mode, I often saw counts down to 864p rather commonly, and around 1152p at its highest in the lightest scenario when looking toward the sky again. VSMs, lumen, and nanite, and all the foliage is very expensive, so these counts and image quality make a lot of sense. Even though Series X reconstructs up to 4K in its performance mode, I thought it looked nothing like 4K usually when the game was moving, especially due to foliage, which is very blurred and ghosty. The quality mode though on Series X targeting 4K looks a lot better, with me commonly counting around 1440p and an image that looks great, albeit at 30 FPS. Beyond image quality, another thing I saw on console is that the game looked unreasonably dark there when I played it the first time on first boot. It was defaulting to the Rec 709 color space. Here I recommend sRGB for SDR users, unless you're in a fully dark room. Okay, with that out of the way, what are the technical issues that I hinted at the beginning of this video? Yes, there are some typical open world bugs in this game, but that's not at all what I'm talking about, and I wanted to make sure I was really representing the game, so I waited to publish this video until I had tested the Day Zero patch, which is what consumers will play. And I'm glad I did that, as the Day Zero patch helped performance quite a bit. But even with that being the case, the game still has some technical performance issues that need to be discussed and hopefully addressed by the developer. The first is in CPU performance, and to a degree some stuttering that happens when you traverse the game world, and this affects every version of the game, PC and console. On PC, there is a lengthy shader pre-compilation step, which in my experience does its job perfectly. I have not seen any shader compilation stutter in this game. Rather, when you run around the game world, you'll see CPU performance issues. For example here, running through the first lesser zone area to the first town in the game on a Ryzen 7 7800X3D. If you look, there are frame time spikes there in the 20 millisecond range, and a few rogue ones that almost crest 30 milliseconds. Pre-release though, before the Day Zero patch, these frame time spikes were typically almost 2 times in length than what you are seeing in this recording here. It is also important to note how CPU limited this run to the town is. With no enemies or NPCs on screen really, we are still CPU limited to around 100 FPS on this big CPU. This is at epic settings though, which are going to be higher than what we find on console. On a CPU that is closer to what we see on consoles, it is disastrous in comparison when you play unlocked at epic settings like this. A Ryzen 5 3600 running to the town sees frame time spikes almost up to 50 milliseconds at time, and the CPU limited frame rate is at its highest in the 50s. This game is super CPU limited, typically with frame times being spiky when you traverse the game world, and that is definitely less than ideal. The second CPU related issue is due to NPC density, which you can see right when you hit the town of Silesia at the end of this run here. Due to the amount of real NPCs milling about here, reacting to you and the environment and more, the CPU CPU performance here becomes erratic, even on a 7800X3D. Just outside the town, we see a number of frame time spikes ranging from 30 to 50 milliseconds over the course of nearly 8 seconds, which then flattens out and stops. During that time, the frame rate tumbles into the 40s, and when in the town itself, frame times can spike up periodically to the 30 millisecond region, and frame rate is just over 60 on average here on the 7800X3D. This area has dozens of stalkers milling about and a lot of interactive stuff, but it is so intense to see a 7800X3D CPU limited to around 60 FPS and even lower than that. On a Ryzen 5 3600, running into the town sees that same performance valley where frame times range from 50 to 80 milliseconds over an 8-second period and then flatten out greatly thereafter. In the town, the Ryzen 5 3600 is just above 30 FPS here on epic settings, with frame time spiking periodically above 33 milliseconds into the 50 millisecond range typically, or even technically a little higher. This behavior applies to any area in the game with more than 20-ish NPCs, so it will happen in the story's cities. The most dramatic NPC-related performance drop I've seen so far is when I hid in this cellar during a storm, when nearly all the stalkers into the area came down into the cellar with me. When this happened, I saw the 7800X3D barely hitting 40 FPS with erratic frame times once again. So yeah, this game is very CPU limited due to the NPCs. The CPU limited behavior drastically affects the console version as well, and specifically the Xbox Series X in its performance mode. Here I presume the game is also GPU limited due to the resolution counts, but due to the CPU limitation, like we see on the Ryzen 5 3600, the Xbox Series X essentially is never going to be hitting 60 FPS. It targets 60 FPS in its performance mode, but it is pretty much never there when it matters. If you are alone in a room or with almost nothing on screen, then yeah, it can be 60 FPS, but in the world or in combat, it'll typically be in the 50s or in the 40s occasionally. This mode is almost never hitting the desired VSync refresh rate and should not be used on a fixed refresh rate display. On a VRR display, it feels a lot better, minus any moments when it is CPU limited intensely or when you traverse the game world, as frame times there will be a bit more erratic, and that still looks a little bit choppy to my eye. Just like on PC, the CPU limited nature extends heavily towards the NPC concentrated areas like in Silesia, but the behavior on Xbox I would say is arguably worse than what we see on PC. Whereas on the Ryzen 5 3600 we saw frame time spikes consistently for 8 seconds when entering the town, on Xbox Series X or S the game instead freezes for about a full 6 seconds. Full on 0 FPS for 6 seconds. It is absolutely brutal and definitely needs fixing. After that, the frame times level out on Xbox Series X in performance mode, and it finds itself just about and above 40 FPS here, with some erratic frame times leading to unsmooth performance when the camera moves about here, and it'll disrupt a VRR presentation. I would say this is something that really needs fixing. Full on freezes are pretty much never acceptable in a game, especially in a console game. Given this poor turnout in the performance mode on Series X, where it is almost never 60 FPS, and how it has inconsistent frame times, I would say the quality mode is vastly preferable. This applies also to the Series S, which only targets 30 FPS in the single mode it has. Due to being frame time capped at 33.3 milliseconds, only the largest, most rare traversal frame time spikes might end up causing the game to waver from a flat 30. And that basically almost never happens, and when it does happen, it tends to be in those high NPC density areas. Where in the town, both the Series S and X will see frame time spikes when moving around there, dipping the FPS to around 29 or 28 occasionally and disrupting VRR. But really, that is the extent to the frame time dipping in that 30 FPS mode. Traversal and combat are generally completely locked in my experience. There are only two negatives of using the 30 FPS mode here on the Series consoles. One is that you still get full-on 6-second freezes when entering the main town on both Series S and X. The other issue is that motion blur is basically non-existent. There is a setting for it on Series X, like on PC, but it doesn't seem to apply to gameplay. Only cutscenes. This is true for both PC and console, but 30 FPS without motion blur looks rather framey and not as smooth as it arguably could. On PC, you can tweak the config file to force motion blur to a higher value, which looks nice. And it would be great if this setting for motion blur on PC and Xbox consoles could affect gameplay motion blur, so it would make lower frame rates like 30 more tolerable. and that is essentially the lay of the land here for Stalker 2's technical performance. It is a very CPU heavy game. I think it does make sense to a degree given the density and the amount of NPC interactions we see here, and you can definitely see that it is testing lower end CPUs. The Ryzen 5 3600 utilization statistics show it being blasted to near 100% CPU utilization when running unlocked. Still, I would like to see the devs work on the CPU limited nature of this game. One thing I do not recommend at all is running this game completely unlocked. Take that Ryzen 5 3600. When running the game at high, it still has inconsistent frame times when running around the world, and those frame times can exceed almost 30 milliseconds. But using a frame rate lock of 30, using NVIDIA's half refresh rate VSync shows a much more smooth experience with a completely smooth frame time graph, excluding when entering Zalicia. I find that a vastly preferable and more consistent experience than an unlocked frame rate. Same with the Ryzen 7 7800X3D. It has somewhat unstable frame times in the open world, bouncing between 9 or 20 milliseconds there when traversing. But as soon as you add in a 60 FPS lock, it has a completely flat 16.6 millisecond frame timeline there, as the CPU is no longer being overburdened while fully unlocked. The only caveat, of course, is frame time spikes still exist in the main town. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is please invest into a frame time cap in this game and pretty much all games, as frame time caps ensure smoothness and consistency that is otherwise not there. Now with that out of the way, this is the end of my technical review for Stalker 2. It is a game that I think plays really well and it lives up to the Stalker name, but it had a troubling review period with a thankfully better day zero launch experience. What reviewers played was a lot less polished than what players have now. Still, it requires some work post-launch, I would say on the CPU side of things, specifically to get areas with NPCs running a lot better if possible. And yes, it should not make a Series X freeze for multiple seconds at a time. That goes without saying. Until that is fixed though, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did like it, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, support on Patreon, follow on Blue Sky, and as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und Slava Ukraini!